want to welcome you to our webinar, which is the 9th webinar in our webinar series, which has been part of the pre-conference process. But now we want to collect the knowledge, we want to continue, and we want to find a new format. So I'm very happy we are here, and we will speak about the melting of the iceberg, a global approach of towards micro-interventions. And in our previous webinars, we were speaking about complexities and infrastructures related to climate change and migration. And I saw that Stephen Wertewig is here, and he was doing one of the webinars too. So welcome to everybody. Today, our focus is, and this is of course a metaphor, on the melting icebergs. And why this metaphor? I think we are speaking a lot about bursting icebergs. Those are the narratives we often see when speaking about climate change and migration. So it's all about fear and abrupt or disruption. So, but it is not only the bursting icebergs that will soon be the main drivers of environment-induced migration, but the more silent, slow onset events that become crucial for global climate dynamics, and that's what we know. Saying this, I think our attention must go away from movie-like scenarios, as you can see here, of catastrophe and rescue, which is always the next thing to do if you have a catastrophe. It is not only the warming, but also the loss of biodiversity, the lack of respect for sustainable forms of production, and our expectation of unlimited mobility. That we must speak about, I think. And if you have closer look at the on the main findings of the IPCC report, the state of the art, you can read, that is chapter 7, which is on migration. You can read that, or you can see that for the first time we have a chapter on its own in the IPCC report, which is already telling. And then you also can read that the findings are mainly that we observe more climate-related migration that is within countries. And if you check for internal displacement monitoring, so you would see that in the last year, could you close down your micro? Thanks. In the last year, so in 2021, we had nearly 24 million internally displaced people. And the World Bank last year said that until the year 2050, we will have about 260 million internally displaced people. So those are numbers. And we observe that this is occurring mainly in the countries, it's internal migration, or within the region. And we also read that migration can be among a wider set of possible adaptation alternatives. So that is interesting for us. And we will focus on that also in our webinar. The consequences of slow onset events on migration will become massive from 2050 on. That topic so needs more attention, and that is why we are here today. At the moment, we see, I do not know if you have seen the report of the Endgame group. They come up very strongly with the issue of displacement due to climate change, and migration scholars argue in a different direction. So we have on a way some sort of developments on the climate in natural science, focusing on climate change as a driver for displacement and migration. And on the other hand, we have the migration scholars, which always fear to be too alarmistic, for example. We have no precise numbers, neither on migration nor on the local impact of climate change. So, and we see that the framing of migration differs highly. So it can be seen either as part of loss and damage. So migration is seen as a fact that is a difficulty, is a loss and damage for a country. So that would have extreme political consequences. And on the other hand, we see a layer of the debate saying, well, migration is just normal. So it is in between these layers, we have the complexities and we have the contradictions we see at the moment. The debate concentrates pretty much on the global south. We turn a blind eye to the resource-hungry forms of migration and mobility in the global north up to today. And a next point is that we drop the blind eye, or we turn the blind eye to the consequences of climate change also in Germany, in Europe, and you have seen the droughts in the summer or the flooding. So that is an interesting point here. A next thing we see is that we have not we miss a normative compass of how global solidarity for whom should look like. And that is, maybe we can speak about such approaches also. We have a lack of interdisciplinary research, and this brings us together here, I think. So our topic today is slow onset environmental change that is linked to migration. What is the content? We will look on climate change and migration, on the local responses to rapid onset events, which we see often as floodings, typhoons, or wildfires. But we have such slow onset dynamics that are crucial for the dynamics of global climate change. The focus is on that. And we want to focus on the adaptation strategies on the spot. We concentrate on micro-interventions in reaction of environmental degradation, so extractivism, for example. We will focus on livelihoods in Mexico. We will focus on remittances and risk reduction in the Filipino community. We will look on exploitation and destruction of natural resources in many places of the world. And we argue in our webinar that we see nested political economies at work, and that we need a global and interdisciplinary perspective to understand those dynamics. This is what we are speaking about in the next 40 to 50 minutes. And I'm very pleased to introduce you to our speakers, our fabulous speakers today, which are Mrs. Laurie Hunter, Professor Laurie Hunter. She's at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and she's the director of the population program and also the program on environment and society. She's a long-standing, outstanding expert on migration and public health on society. We have welcome. Hello, Laurie. Good to see you. We have Dominic Kniveton, Professor Dominic Kniveton. He's at the University of Sussex, and there he is a professor on climate change and society. He's also an advisor for the United Nations Environmental Program, and his work focuses pretty much on future climate scenarios, for example, in Western Africa, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. He's also involved into the foresight. And Dominic, I can't see you on my screen, but that might depend on my screen. I don't know. Welcome. Good to see you here. And we have Professor Luisa Veronis. She's at the University of Ottawa, and she's a professor of geography, and her focus is on environmental migration, globalization, and gender. So welcome, Luisa. Good to see you. We have, each speaker has 10 minutes, and we have a 15 minutes question and answers session afterwards. And we start with Laurie Hunter. She is going to speak on Mexico. We have Mr. Dominic Kniveton. He will speak on extractivism and local degradation. And we have Luisa Veronis on the role of remittances for the communities. So I just would like to invite you to come up with your 10-minute speech, and I shut up here. And I'm happy to ask Chloe to jump in. Wait, I will go out with my, excuse me. So here we go. Please, Chloe.
Hello, everybody. You can see my slides okay? Yeah, great. So hi, everyone, and welcome. And it's really fabulous to be here. Start of the day for me in Colorado, and it's a really nice day, a way to start my day. So I'm here to offer some pretty local level examples of migration research that integrates measures of slow onset changes. So I'll be speaking from a couple of papers that were published by myself and several collaborators over the past several years that look specifically at migration from rural Mexico, and with a focus actually on international migration as opposed to internal, which is also so important and we'll hear from later. I'll offer first a little bit of foundational information, give you some Mexico examples, and briefly mention what I think is needed next as far as research. So this is a framework. Dominic Kniveton was part of this back in 2011. So it's over 10 years old, and it's been incredibly helpful for the migration research community that looks at the decision. It's a conceptual framework, right? That sort of articulates the various aspects of individual lives and contexts that shape decisions as to whether or not to migrate. So, you know, we know a lot about macro level drivers. For example, somebody's age, sex, education, wealth influences the likelihood may move. In addition, there are meso level factors like political legal frameworks, which are really important in the context of the Mexico-US migration that I'm speaking about here. So the decision to migrate or stay being influenced by micro or meso factors. What's been really useful about this framework is it also engages macro level drivers, and these include what we know about political drivers. I just mentioned policies, for example, international border policies, demographic factors, so the size or density of populations in both origins and destinations may influence the decision to move or not. Economic opportunities are obviously really key. We're talking here about the potential use of migration as an adaptation strategy, right? In the face of resource decline, slow onset resource decline, that can be thought of as in part economically driven if individuals and households aren't able to craft sustainable livelihoods in their origin areas. And then environmental drivers. What I think has been most impactful about this framework is, in addition to direct environmental drivers, say like natural hazards or something, they also force you to think about the ways in which environmental factors shape some of these other drivers. So, for example, slow onset drivers, right, impacting a household's ability to earn income. So if you look under the economics, so it's the interaction between the slow onset. I think it's especially critical for this particular webinar, the interaction between the slow onset and some of these other drivers. So I think that's just a useful framing. When I think about the literature as a whole, these are some of the things that have been documented in a wide variety of places across the globe. These environmental pressures come in lots of different forms, right? And it's important to sort of acknowledge that and to think about the ways in which different types of environmental pressures might have different types of effects. In some areas, we have indeed seen that rainfall deficits exhibit higher levels of outmigration, and I'll be showing some of that to you in just a second. These environmental push factors intertwine with other things to shape vulnerability. And that's what you saw in the framework that I presented just a slide ago. And I think it's also important to remember that in rural households, migration is just one of many different potential adaptive strategies. So thinking carefully about where migration fits within this broader sort of portfolio of choices. That's actually one thing I think we could use more research on. Let me quickly move to the Mexico examples. I'll just provide several, and I'll actually show you a sort of a no-no, but I really, I'm going to show you some numbers, some results from the projects, because I think it's useful just to, I tell you, when I first started sociology, it blew my mind that we could actually see social patterns in data, and it continues to just really thrill me. I mean, I think it's just really an extraordinary thing. So that's what we'll be doing here. This is a circle graph put forward by the Wittgenstein Center, and what I want you to see here is these colors all around the edge are global regions, and the yellow one is Latin America, and the red one is North America. And that big swath of yellow means that there's that many people. it's international migration, a huge stream of individuals coming from Latin America to North America. You also see a big stream from Latin America to Europe, but that big yellow band between Latin America and North America is what me and my colleagues have worked to model as related to environmental pressures. So why study environmental aspects of Mexican migration? There was a lot of work on this migration stream up until like the like around 2015. Most of it didn't even look at environmental factors. It was all about the social, economic, and political drivers. And then we started adding environmental pieces. So, and of course, climate projections suggest there's going to be a lot of different kinds of pressure, reduced precipitation, and increasing heat in many of the agricultural dominant areas of rural Mexico. And the majority of the agriculture there is actually rain-fed. So this is super important. We used in our research some typical sources for on Mexico-US migration, some data from the Mexico Migration Project, and also data from the Mexican census. We also used what's called IPM. So it's the census level microdata that's merged with environmental data available through the University of Minnesota. So the Mexican Migration Project, if any of you are interested in doing work on Mexico migration, is really a rich data source. It was begun in 1982, and it's a moving sample where they sample on an annual basis from communities, municipios that have high levels of migration. We use 2 different time periods in the work that I'll show you here. So this is just a very descriptive piece. If you look, the rainfall is the solid line and migration are the dotted line. And I think this is really interesting because if you peak here, so rainfall declines at a period when migration increased. This is international migration. So the rainfall dipped, but migration went up. Here you see rainfall going up, but migration going down. So this might suggest that as times are more flush, as households have less pressure because there's more rainfall, maybe they don't move. That might be indicative of using migration as an adaptation strategy in times of stress. And we see, but this is a little bit of a puzzle. Migration went down. I'm sorry, rainfall is the solid line again. Rainfall dips, migration goes up in later periods. Now, this is just descriptive, right? So we do some multivariate modeling to really tease this out. And another thing I want to mention, which is important to our work, is this is in what we called historical regions. So we know that social networks are really important when it comes to households making migration decisions. If you know individuals in potential destination areas, it's much easier to make the decision to go there because you have some support on the other end. And much of our work in Mexico actually finds that migration is much more likely from those areas that already have strong migration histories when it comes to Mexico-US migration flows. That's an important finding from our work. Let me give you, let's see, methods. Here we modeled the probability of an adult household member emigrating to the US within 2 years from the survey. And we looked at recent rainfall. So what we did was we predicted the likelihood that there would be a migrant. We controlled for all sorts of characteristics of the migrant and the household, but we're interested in seeing if the environmental measure, especially the slow onset, because that's what we're doing here in the webinar, made a difference when it came to migration. And we did in fact find that was the case. So in non-historical sending regions, so these are areas where they don't have super strong migration histories as far as sending individuals to the US. We found that, you see, if last year was a severe drought, and the negative sign means individual or households were much less likely to send a migrant to the US. If 2 years ago was a drought, they were even more less likely to send a migrant. So that drought squelched migration, if you will. On the other hand, in areas where there was a strong history of sending migration, look at that 2 years ago severe drought. So if a household experienced a severe drought a couple of years ago, they were much more likely to send a migrant to the US. So that's evidence of a slow onset effect, if you will, right? So if you see the last year severe drought, that number is negative. So if a household experienced a really recent drought, they were less likely to send a migrant. They might be in really hard times. But a couple of years after that, more likely to send a migrant. And that suggests to us, right, it is this sort of longer term impact over time that makes a real difference. And that's how it sort of situates within what we're talking about here today. This is another paper, but it has a similar finding. And here we looked at rainfall. And so this is actually, as you move right on this, on the x-axis on this graph, rainfall declines or drought is getting more intense. So what I want you to see here is the most significant result was that interaction in dry states. So in places that are already really dry, when you've got drought, there's much more migration, right? So that also makes sense. That's also a slow onset impact of sort of the long-term nature of the rainfall deficit effect. I'll show you one last one, and we'll close up here soon. I had 10 minutes. So this is also a sort of a longer term spell that I wanted to bring forward here. So this is the migration probability on the y-axis, so the likelihood that a household sends a migrant. And this is the duration of the hot spell, the warm spell on the x-axis. So again, a longer spell of warm temperatures increases the likelihood of migration, especially for places that have a strong element of male agricultural labor, which is what that dark line is. So this also sort of teased out some interactions, but what I want you to really get is the fact that this duration of stress is what really shot up the migration probability. I think I won't do that one just given time. Overall findings from this sort of body of work, I showed you 3 different empirical examples. We have some more. If you're interested, feel free to write me. But most influence on environmental conditions came in dry areas. So places that were already dry were particularly vulnerable. I mean, that makes sense. So you're already sort of on the edge. I didn't show you this piece, but the rural versus urban was important, with rural areas experiencing much more environmental migration in response to environmental stress, which also makes a lot of sense because they're far more agriculturally dependent in the direct sense. International versus internal. So we actually were modeling migration to the US, and that was actually pretty heavily impacted relative to internal. But this is, as you saw in the circle graph of migration, this is a really long-standing migration stream. So it's a different context when we think about the fact that there are already so many sort of well-established flows. And as a result, there are really strong social networks, which means that in this particular setting, international migration is less rare. And we also found, and I didn't show you this piece, it was the one I skipped over, that actually the environmental strain, the slow onset environmental strain, impacted undocumented migration more than documented migration, which is quite interesting and I think really important in the context of sort of the nastiness that you see in US politics right now around undocumented migrants. So key to this webinar, increased likelihood of migration when the drought was in the recent past or with longer duration heat, and especially from regions with migration histories. I'll just quickly mention, I think, what's important for researchers to do next, and I think we'll see some of this in the subsequent 2 presentations. But one thing I've always wanted to do is sort of look at migration as one amongst the many choices households have with regard to adaptation. Migration is not likely the first choice. Is it the second, the third, the fourth, or so on? And I think that's really important when we're thinking about climate futures. And related, households have differential choices to differential responses to environmental pressures, all sorts of different impacts. We're going to hear about remittances, which I think is super important. So the impacts are both not just in the destination areas, but the origin areas as well. And I'm really looking forward to that presentation. There's super important triads. You know, we've looked actually quite a lot at this point at the environment migration connection, but then there are things like health. right? I think it's really important for us to expand also into these other kinds of triads of other kinds of social processes and social consequences and social dimensions as related to migration and environment. And of course, there's really important policy impacts and approaches, which I think we'll hear some from Dominic, Dr. Kniveton. So I'm looking forward to that as well. So thanks so much. I hope that provided some useful information. I look forward to the Q&A and also hearing from the other speakers.
Thank you so much, Loie. I would clap my hand if I could. Thank you so much.
No worries. Thanks.
Wait, I have a reaction. Yeah. Okay. And I just would hand over to Dominic. Dominic, please go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. And thank you, Laurie, for excellent explanation. I think it sort of parallels quite a lot of where we've been going is the question of under what circumstances or context do people move, rather than do they move because of climate change or the environment. And so sort of slightly moves away, hopefully, from this environmental determinism that I think the IPCC got stuck in for a long time and is now emerging from. So this is some work I've been doing with my colleagues. It's part of, I'm on, just because I'm old, it's not actually any sign of anything apart from age. Is the International Resource Panel. So there's three main panels of the United Nations Environment Programme, the IPCC, which we've all heard of, the IPBES, so that's the International Panel of Biodiversity and Environmental, Ecosystem Services, and the International Resource Panel. So essentially the top two are the ones that are, to me, a lot of about panic, 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 and the International Resource Panel is maybe there is a solution, but also veers into the panic, panic, panic button. So that is a slide showing who they are. So it's made up of 36 scientists, and they're asked by a steering committee of government and European Commission and UNEP to look into various things. And we were asked to look into the relationship between natural resources and migration. Now, of course, the elephant in the room with all of this is who is saying something is migration and who is saying it isn't migration, and particularly that comes to when they decide what type of migration it is. I found the whole thing quite abstract. I'm a rubbish physicist, not a physicist of rubbish, just a not very good one by training. And you know, climate change is an abstract. Climate is an abstract, and the change is an abstract. That's too much for me. So I was quite welcomed the idea of looking at natural resources and natural resource management, because it's something much more tangible. Laurie mentioned Sabine Henry's study, which is about 8,800 migration histories, and very few of those 8,800, I think it was 43, I think it was 29 of them actually said it was the rainfall that caused them to move, yet statistically that was the reason they moved. So it was a significant factor in their movement. So much more about why people think they are moving themselves. And again, Laurie's highlighted the foresight projection. I think has been immune a little bit, luckily or not luckily, but there's quite a lot you could criticize about this. But it's a good place to start, that basically there are lots of different scale interactions on a decision to migrate, stay, or become trapped or become immobile. And they interact with each other. So those five, much like sustainable livelihoods approach, that there is some interchangeability and linking between environmental, political, demographic, economic, and social. So what are the kind of linkages between natural resources and migration? And the ones we looked at were the influence of hydropower, so obviously a climate adaptation, reducing emissions, seen at the international scale as a very good adaptation, its influence on migration, the loss of ecosystem services, obviously a negative impact of climate change, and the loss of livelihoods. Going through the traffic light, I've never seen a traffic light in purple, but if they did have one, from natural resources, one that's more ambiguous influence is the influence of resource rushes and artisanal mining. And going the other way, of course, migration influences the use of natural resources. Remittances, social and financial, have an influence on how natural resources occur. So there's lots of different ways in which these two interact. If you look at a very macro scale, so on my vertical axis, I have the net migration rate of different countries. The circle is the size of the GDP, so countries that are richer obviously have a bigger circle. And on the horizontal axis is how much of the GDP comes from natural resources. So you can see the Qatar, Oman, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, the oil-rich countries, and they have a high into that country, so a positive net migration rate. And somewhere like Tonga, which has very low natural resources as a percent of their GDP, has a negative migration rate. That relationship is significant, but only just. It's very, it depends what level of significance you choose. It's a weak relationship. So there is a small significant relationship between natural resources in terms of how much GDP it represents and its net migration. Yet at any level, virtually, so all natural resource levels of natural resources, there are examples of countries where there is positive, more incoming than outgoing migrants, and negative. So there's obviously something else going on there, which is hardly surprising when you're looking at something so macro scale. So natural resources mediate, they're like the in-between place in between global environmental change processes and human mobility. However, but for me, I had to remember it, that of course natural resources aren't only affected by global environmental change. Local land tenure, international corporations, all of these things affect natural resources. The trouble with looking at natural resources is if you're an economist, there's a lot of, they're very endogenous to the system. So you have problems in separating them out in essentially regression equations. So we have, at a very simple level, a relationship between natural resources at international level and migration. The more natural resources you have, the more in-migration you have overall. So essentially that's been driven by the oil-rich states, which have a lot of migration to those countries because that's where the work is. However, and there is a big however, there's a lot of noise in between, and that's the interesting stuff. So to me, there has been this question always lurking around the back of the IPCC, which is migration a failure to adapt, or is it a form of adaptation? As Laurie explained, if you speak to a migrationist, they'll say, no, it's a form of adaptation. And if you speak to an environmental people, they say, oh, no, it's a failure to adapt. Of course, the truth is it can be either, and it can be both simultaneously. One of the questions about which it is at what scale. And I alluded to this earlier, but this is, we're going to skip that, don't know where that appeared. Hydropower is a good example of this. So we did a quick estimate, so using satellite data, of how many people had been displaced. And I think we'd all agree it's not that much of a tricky categorization, that when you're forced to move because of a dam, then you really are displaced. And they're the most direct evidence of how natural resources interact with migration, and it interacts in it by displacing people. And we made an estimate of how many people have been displaced since 2000 to 2018. And that's only going to get bigger as the world plans and has already planned bigger and more hydropower schemes. Artisanal mining, this is gold mining in Ghana, is another example of a relationship with between natural resources and migration, and they're often resource rushes are related to big mobility events, and they can be a good adaptation in some ways for the people involved. They can become, is the important word there, richer, more socioeconomic, a higher social economic level, but of course they can have bigger costs to the society, and so not be a very good adaptation, because they reduce, of course, the amount of money there, and they can be environmentally destructive. So going back, he flips there very quickly. Scale, we felt, was really something that determined whether something is a migration, whether migration is an adaptation or a maladaptation. And of course, it depends on for whom the adaptation is occurring. So it might be a good adaptation for rich people, it might be a poor adaptation for people who end up in slums and are exploited. And equally, sorry, I knew I put it in there for a reason, the remittances that people send home can have a positive impact or a negative impact. So the red-green diagram on the right is from Jeff Henrik, another panel member, and he was looking at, well, one of the things he was looking at was green remittance bonds. So this idea that remittances can be used for restoration of land, to increase productivity and feed into the Sustainable Development Goals, but equally they can mean more land degradation. So it's the how do we leverage sustainable resource management from remittances. The last question, which is the one I suppose really that I think was the most useful, was not to ask whether climate change or natural resource degradation caused migration or not because of these problems of deciding whether it was a good adaptation or a bad adaptation, but was just understanding what you could then do. And I'm currently doing some work in Horn of Africa with IGAD around pastoralist movements. And this is one of the things that we keep coming up against is, so what? So that you know that there's people moving, what are you going to do about it? So what and who's going to benefit from anything you do? One of the things I've borrowed from my health research is looking at systems understanding to understand the policy options. So this horrible looking diagram is something that Sonia Carlson, a colleague of mine, authored with myself and Lisa Haywood. And essentially, it was one of three studies. This one was a literature review, but one was in the Philippines from interviews with people and from storytelling. And what it tries to do is it links all of the different elements that go into the migration decision. So if I just start you off here, climate change was linked, the brackets are how many papers, to livestock loss in the Sahel region. That meant there was agricultural failure or food insecurity, agricultural failure, and led to male-out migration, which led to, there was some evidence of gendered immobility, so women being unable to move, and vulnerability, which led to social tension, which led to more forced migration, or alternatively, there are evidence of it leading to trapped populations and displacement. So the idea being that there's different pathways you can choose through this that lead to the things you're interested in. And in summary, so we looked at Bangladesh, Philippines, and the Sahel. For an example of some pathways in Bangladesh, they were debt, it involved illegal livelihoods and natural resource conflicts. And what the policy entry points then were around supporting people, so not necessarily migration policies, so social protection and looking at post-disaster loans and relief programs, not about whether you could or couldn't have any rights by moving to Dhaka, for instance, which used to be one of the main problems of migrants. Philippines, you can read them quicker than I can say them, but some other pathways. So with this systems understanding, to me, hopefully the point was opening up what policies you could look at and moving away from this environmental determinism, which says we will get more migrants with climate change or less migrants or more trapped people, to actually saying, well, what can we do about it? So the systems mapping, it's not like a systems dynamics model where you actually are putting numbers to it. You're just highlighting the different pathways that people live on, how their natural resources are managed and their access to them, to their form of mobility for their choice, as it were, their desirability. So hopefully that has kept us. No, I've gone over as well, so terribly sorry, but that's my bit.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. A bit over time, but that is still fine. Thank you so much for your presentation. Luisa, may I ask you to come in with your presentation?
Yes, I would like that. So can I share my screen? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, there. I will try. Hopefully everything will work out. And okay, sorry, I have.
That's all good.
Okay, so first of all, thank you everyone for attending our webinar, and I especially like to thank Felicitas for organizing and initiating this, and also my co-speakers. I'd like to thank you for setting the ground, and it's especially great that Dominic, you said you're very concrete, because mine, I think, will go into the more abstract. So hopefully I will bring things together, but in particular, I'd like to complicate the narrative. There is a concern, particularly, I guess, from media and policymakers, of trying to make environmental migration something simple and reduce it to the environment being a factor there. So I think we're able of complex thinking, and as Dominic showed, those complex graphics, humans are able to handle complex ideas, even though it's not necessarily easy to address them on the ground. So our goal is, I guess, to help find solutions on the ground. So the ideas that we'll present here draw from a research project I did a few years ago with my colleague, Robert McClellan, who's very well known in this field around environmental migration, and other colleagues from the University of Ottawa. Our starting point was Canada receives a lot of migrants from every part of the world, including hot spots of climate or environmental change. Therefore, we asked immigrants in Canada whether the environment had played a role, had influenced directly or indirectly their decision to migrate to Canada. And we were able to interview a variety of different immigrant groups. I will show you mostly the findings from the city of Ottawa. So we had participants from Haiti, from the Horn of Africa, French-speaking sub-Saharan Africa, and the Philippines. I wanted to look at Mexico, but we're a bit overstretched. Nevertheless, I think this will speak to some of the ideas that were presented. We did key informant interviews and focus groups, as well as personal interviews, and a lot of the issues that have been addressed were relevant. So what I found fascinating was people from very, very different regions had similar stories to tell. Now, among the participants, some had come as refugees or asylum seekers, others were economic immigrants or through family reunification. And from the Philippines, it was the live-in caregiver, a temporary migrant worker program. So we had a diversity of people. A lot of them were quite educated. We conducted interviews in French and English, and for refugees from Somalia, we had research assistants who helped translate. There's 3 key messages, and no, the time is tight. So the main message is that I think a lot of the discourses, the narratives are still about the environment. And I'd like to complicate things. And in fact, what is the environment is very, very difficult to actually pinpoint. And they're very complex processes that compound over time, space, and scale. And I'm so glad Dominic brought up scale previously, but I think Laurie's presentation also showed about, what is really the environment. So among our participants, they told us not so much about environmental change in an abstract way, but really linked to very direct activities, economic activities like resource exploitation, resource extraction. And here's the link with the natural resources, in particular things like deforestation, so logging for wood, that then led to a variety of other problems, land degradation, erosion, desertification, and so on and so forth, and leading to food insecurity. Mining, and we had this fascinating image of a gold mine and the impacts it has on the regions. So both in sub-Saharan Africa and the Philippines, it told us about the impacts of mining. Then these environmental problems were often compounded with conflict and political instability, where it was hard to tell whether the environment, let's say desertification, was leading to conflict or the other way around. And some of our participants from Somalia were traditional herders who were stuck in a valley between 2 areas of conflict, and they couldn't engage in the normal migration process during drought to go to a different valley where their herds could have access to water. So what was the problem? Was it the drought or the conflict? As well as agribusiness or agricultural overexploitation, particularly monocrops and the use of fertilizers and so on. And they also told us about complex links between environmental impacts in rural areas and then migration to urban areas, and lack of infrastructure and sanitation, and dangers like flooding and landslides, illnesses that were waterborne, that were all linked, in fact, to overpopulation, lack of infrastructure. I have a number of quotes just because I believe in listening to the migrants and their perceptions or their views on this. And here was complicated. And they pointed out that it wasn't the environment. It was a complex set of circumstances. So here's participants from Haiti who spoke of the fact that it's an agricultural country. Over 60% of the population is still rural, but due to a series of political decisions, lack of investment in infrastructure like irrigation, no access to fertilizer, and so on, people have very little food production or harvesting. So there's no rice, there are no pigs. So they turn to cutting wood to make charcoal that they sell in order to buy food for the families. But their position was, our environmental problem in Haiti is above all a conjuncture of bad political decisions. So that's the environmental problem. And so here, we can't really tell what really is the source. Is it the environment? And some of it is actually human activities like cutting wood to make charcoal to feed your family, and then there's no tree planting, and that causes environmental problems in the first place, but it's really the state is not providing. So issues of vulnerability. In Africa, very similar discourses were, they said we have environmental problems linked to water, drought, rising temperatures. There are problems with resource management, deforestation, because in fact, the water scarcity doesn't come on its own. There is a cause to it. And basically the problems were everyday life, just have a livelihood, the way Laurie was speaking earlier. So there are environmental problems, but the environmental problems are linked to a lack of economic prosperity, and then they can't do anything, which causes further problems. So the second message is around migration, and is it adaptation? Is it maladaptation? Is it the problem? Is it the solution? Again, very complex drivers that are often hard to distinguish. Is it economic, social, political? Who knows? And does it really matter? If people feel the need, the urgency to leave, they will find a way to do so. So is it really that important to know what the cause of their migration is? And trying to figure out what is the driver. And we've done a book chapter recently with colleagues where we look at all of the different factors, and they are closely interlinked, so it's hard to distinguish one from the other. So again, some quotes here from Haiti, where people have some food when they live in rural areas, but there are no roads, there is no water. It's really the government who should develop those areas. So is it an environmental problem or a political problem or an economic problem? Nevertheless, people then go to the capital city, Port-au-Prince, but there's overpopulation and there's slums and a variety of other problems. So in Haiti, people try to leave rural areas because of the hardships, but then in the cities, they face another whole set of hardships. It's not any easier. And ultimately, people who can afford, who have the resources, they will go abroad. So the links, I think, between internal and international migration are really important, something we have looked at in our work. So just wanted to show you that from Africa, a very similar discourse. So here's a different country from Burundi. There is drought in one region, there is too much rain in another region, but ultimately people leave the interior to find work in cities. But really, those who are concerned, because we're talking about international migration, those who have knowledge, who have capital, human capital, in order to migrate abroad, to go to Europe, the US, and Canada. So it's really a matter of resources. And here again, we can't reduce it to the environment or the more complex linkages between all those different types of migrations, and the fact that people ultimately look for livelihood, look for jobs. And some of our participants here from Sub-Saharan Africa, with someone from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, said, because they asked us during the focus group, well, what do you mean environment? What are you looking for? I was like, no, anything that you think can be considered the environment. And they said, well, it's really difficult to distinguish factors behind immigration. And environmental problems are linked to economic issues and political issues. So the environmental problem in Kinshasa was related to urban infrastructure and the fact that the city didn't cut trees to build roads and whatnot. So how to separate economic issues from the political and environmental, even from humanity. And here the fact that humans arguably are part of the environment. So it's more complicated. And there were security issues and so on. So the third message, the need to think holistically and act multidimensionally. So focus energy on long-term and multi-scale sustainable development in all sectors, political, economic, social, and environmental simultaneously, as I think Dominic was trying to show with that complex policy mapping. So here I'm coming finally to the remittances to show the complexity in the thinking. So with regard to remittances, as was introduced, the debate is whether they're really a sustainable form of development or ultimately just conspicuous consumption, where migrants improve their homes and they buy stuff. But there is evidence for risk reduction. Households that have migrants abroad who send money can improve their homes, for example, or have better communication, which allows them to make decisions in a timely fashion if they need to leave, or find ways to address any imminent disaster. So in the Philippines, our participants similarly explained the complexity of the remittances. So most of them had women who left the Philippines, came to Canada to work as nannies or domestics, and they were sending money back. So it helped reduce vulnerability to environmental events. And also people could leave their home and go back faster to rebuild their home or their community. Or people could just escape. The houses were better built. There was especially a second floor so that they could go there to be safe during flood, for example. But there is a very complex relationship between remittances and risk reduction or increased vulnerability. And so there is evidence that households can cope better with environmental problems, as was alluded to earlier. But in fact, it's not only the remittances, there also needs to be certain education levels in order to use those remittances in a way that can help or prevent vulnerability. And in some cases, households with remittances build bigger houses that are then in fact more vulnerable to things like floods. So here remittances, there is a link between the financial, the social, and the human capital, and whether remittances allow people to stay put or rather to leave. And in the case of the Philippines, when there was a disaster, it was really difficult for the families who depended on remittances to get remittances because there was no electricity, no way to send money. And in fact, they were hanging, waiting to receive help. And it also, broader inequalities came up, whereas those who didn't have families abroad, in fact, were vulnerable. So if only some people in a community through remittances can be safe, it tells us about the broader issue of what about the families who cannot send someone abroad who will then send them remittances. So to conclude, I'd like to encourage people to avoid, so there was environmental determinism, I'm speaking more of environmental reductionism. So this is about the environment, which really puts the environment as different and outside of society and human, and actually really avoids a question of whose responsibility. So I'd like to encourage more holistic thinking about how the environment is linked to the economy and society more broadly, and to adopt policy measures. And I'm glad Dominic showed us a more concrete way of doing so. I'm going into kind of a more abstract thinking, but that it's a lot more complex than what is oftentimes portrayed, and we need complex approaches to solve the problems. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.